caring for our land. Growing our essentials. Cultivating our future. Every producer leaves a legacy. Our amazing grasslands.
I had spent all my life on the home place, and back in the 80s we decided that we just couldn't make it there anymore because of high interest and low commodity prices, and then there was 3 families trying to make a living off the home place, and so when we had the opportunity to come into this place, that was my goal to begin with, was to make this place more productive so that we could continue to do what we love, and that's to ranch.
I grew up on a ranch about 75 miles from here, right at the southern edge of Perkins County. Much different terrain, much different soils, rotational grazing, and a lot of these scientific things were not heard of when I was growing up. We turned cows into a pasture, and they probably stayed there a long time. So when Chuck and I got married and lived on a different ranch, started learning some different practices, and by the time we got here, it was a whole new ball game.
We moved on this place in 2001 and leased it for the first 3 years and then bought it at that time. And so with any transfer of ownership, you have to deal with the prior owner's management. And so after going through 2, 4, and 6, all 3 real dry years, we realized the importance of keeping the moisture on the place. And so with the rotation grazing, we have seen less erosion and better plant growth because of the organic matter being put back into the soil. Our place is made up of gently rolling terrain, sandy loam soils. We do have some areas of some clay pan. In the 18 years we've been on the place, I would say that 90% of that was clay pan at that time has a little bit growing on it. So we're making some progress there. Originally there was 900 acres of farmland, and we've seeded down to where we're only cultivating no-till 500 acres. And a lot of that has been put back into native grasses. And of course, then we do farm. We've got some corn that we put in yearly, and last year we put in some rye into some alfalfa ground that we terminated. I'm hoping to go back with some warm season grass when we get through no-tilling it. Some of the older natives coming back, we saw a small patch of prairie sandreed. We have one pasture that was basically blue grama and buffalo grass. And this year we've had timely rains and kept everything growing and good. And we've seen the western wheatgrass come in and thicken up. We're also seeing some needlegrass that's coming back in those areas. So that long duration of rest has really helped, and our controlled grazing has made quite a difference. We've got an area that's got some saline seeps. We planted western wheatgrass and green needle in that area, threw in a little bit of falcata and Sicer milk vetch. We're seeing that the western wheatgrass is starting to fill in those areas. It's a little thin, but it's growing. Those areas have dried up because we've got a perennial growing there versus farming, because that all was farmland for 60 years maybe. And conventional tilled until 2005, we went to no-till, and been no-till ever since. We do have a portable water system. I just took a 16-foot steel water tank and plumbed it with a valve. We've got an 1.25 inch plastic pipe, 200-pound PSI that we can drag around. We've got 1,200 feet of pipe on that line. And the cows get used to trailing in. It doesn't have a lot of capacity, but it sure worked well during the summer. We introduced cover crops. We've been doing it for 10 years. I went to a seminar that Jay Furr from North Dakota was speaking, and he said, you know, the best thing you can do before you go from a monoculture to a grass pasture mix is plant cover crops. We've had real good success with that. We've seen a reduction in chemical use and an increase in organic matter in our fields. We took sample for planting corn a year ago, and we were at 3.4 on our organic matter, and I was visiting with Jay Furr about how much fertilizer to use, and that was the first time we used the Haney test, so it was kind of new, and we were trying to figure out how to analyze that test, and he said, boy, he'd like to have that chunk of ground. It was a good test.
We were fortunate to be able to raise our two kids, Tiffany and Jack, on a couple different ranches. Three of our grandchildren live very close to us. The other is just a couple hundred miles away. And they're still at the age where it's fun to come out to the ranch and help. They have an ownership in the sheep.
We run a few sheep here, and it's kind of a project to basically keep the weeds down around the place. Grandkids have some sheep of their own, and so they've got that interest when they come out to check on their sheep. But we do allot them just a certain amount of area to graze so that they aren't grazing it into the ground, and they do a good follow-up on the cattle. And the sheep tend to eat some of more of the forbs and finer stuff. It sure gives us an option to increase the production on the place, on our organic matter. Crean has been on my right all the way through this. She has scratched her head a few times and wondered why we're doing it, but she understands that we're trying to build this for the next generation and improve things. This country was settled back in 07 to 012, 1912. There was periods in there where farming practices didn't regenerate the soil, and we would like to leave this place in better shape.
By implementing an innovative approach, the Andersons are making their land more productive and sustainable for generations to come. Coming up, we'll see how a great young couple, Jeff and Marcy Dell, approach ranching as a family and use goats to help combat constant weed pressure.
We are Jeff and Marcy Dell. We ranch and farm north of Nislin, South Dakota.
We run a Angus cattle operation, and we also raise Boer goats. We are a feed-based operation and lease out the majority of our pasture for the cattle. The goats stay around the home place, and we utilize those for smaller areas, weed control, creek banks, and such areas as that we would not utilize for the cattle.
The irrigation land that we have, we spend quite a bit of money and time spraying our fields and getting rid of noxious weeds or the labor that goes with it.
This whole system is based off of large open canals, and so you get whatever weeds, whatever seeds, whatever comes out of the air, off the ground, comes down those canals.
About a year and a half ago, we started doing some research on what can we do and how can we help ourselves to get rid of the weeds and problems that we have. We started doing research for meat goats. We purchased a small herd of them here about a year ago, and we're finding they prefer the weeds. We're assuming and estimating that around 60 to 65% of their diet is preferred to be weeds, and then moving on to the grasses.
If we let them out into a bigger area, they will essentially eat all of the weeds before they even start touching the grass.
They seem to choose the grasses that our cows don't want, so it's a diversity win between the cattle and the goats.
Not only are we cutting out an input cost on weed control by having to buy chemical and spray and fuel and time to go out and spray weeds, we're cutting that input cost out as much as possible. We're using those weeds to feed the goats essentially. So we're turning it into a profit instead of an expense, and hopefully doing a better job by not putting as much chemical on the land. Cattle will go out and they will pick and choose the grasses before they would touch a weed. The goats will essentially consume the majority of plants that the cattle won't touch. Canadian thistle in our area is not a huge problem, but it's an issue. And those goats, as long as you can keep ahead of the thistle and it doesn't get too rank, they will eat that thistle plant down to the ground. They really like creeping jenny. They will totally pick out an area that has creeping jenny in it and eat all the leaves and the vine part of the plant as well. We would like to try to start grazing the cattle through on a rotational grazing system with them, but then follow with the goats. On top of getting rid of the weeds, we feel that now you're going to have the cattle going through and they're grazing the land and they're getting a heavier hoof impact on the land, and they're defecating and urinating on the land, and then the goats are coming through with a different form of fertilizer because they're going to be defecating and urinating on the land. They're going to be eating a different type of plant on the land, and they have a different form of hoof impact as well on the land.
Part of the reason that we moved toward getting the goats and creating more diversity with the livestock that were going to be at home was the fact of our children. We're trying hard to maintain and sustain at our place, as most people that are in the industry are trying to do. We thought adding the goats is a financial benefit to us as well in both, it's another crop to sell twice a year. It is a benefit on the grass. We're growing more native grass. The goats are consuming what our cows aren't wanting to. Plus, we don't have the time and money into spraying fields and working fields and all of that kind of stuff.
Jeff and Marcy have recently gotten into bale grazing on both their cropland and to address specific concerns on pieces of rangeland that maybe have low productivity or have limiting soils. For instance, a clay pan that is very slow water infiltration, low fertility, and it's truly just a bare spot, even in a year like this. With bale grazing, that strategic placement of bales in a situation like that on rangeland I'll speak about, they cut the string or the net wrap off of the bale and then offer limited access for livestock just for a certain number of days or weeks, so that in the wintertime when there isn't growing forage to meet the full dietary need of the livestock, they can consume those bales that were harvested right now in the good time of the year when protein and energy levels are high and can meet most, if not all, of the nutritional requirements.
So on those areas where we roll out the hay or do the bale grazing, we were trying to get more organic matter on the ground. Also the cattle, while they're eating it, they're defecating and urinating on part of the hay, but also the soil around it too. We've started to see repairs in those areas that we have been doing that, either bale grazing or rolling hay out, and concentrating on those areas where the ground is more bare, where there's less production in the soil. And we've started to see an increase in grasses coming back, vegetation coming back in those areas.
The decisions and challenges that we face today are not going to be the same for the future. So we're trying to look at, for our kids' sake, if they should want to stay here or for whoever decides to come back and farm and ranch, how are we preserving the land? How are we helping keep what was native, what was here?
We want to ranch as a family, not just have a family ranch. If we can make this land and this soil better than when we got it, and even hope that our kids can even make it better than we did. So there's something that's totally sustainable for generations to come, and we've improved the land and improved the soil. That would be the ultimate goal.
We moved here in 1958. My dad bought this place, and the pasture over there, the east half was hayland, and the other half was pasture. You put up hay for the cows, and then you fed the cows. The drought of '76 come along, and he sold all the cows. So there was a cross fence between the hayland and the pasture. So that was our rotation until the neighbors come along, and they didn't want to change the salt back and forth, so they just opened the gate. So we had one big pasture.
Over the last few years, I've kind of taken hold of the place here somewhat, probably the last 10, 12 years now, and trying to do a better job of our rotational program, doing some water projects through the game and fish. They're helping us out with some fencing and just trying to do a better job with our grasslands, trying to keep some grass left in the fall, taking care of the weeds, water. That's kind of our goal right now. I'm actually a full-time auctioneer, so 3 to 4 days a week I'm doing auctioning. I work for Hub City Livestock out of Aberdeen, South Dakota on sale days. I get fortunate enough to be able to travel around the country in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, looking at people's livestock for us to sell through our livestock market. As far as like some of the water things, the tires into the water tanks, we've taken some different things from other people that looks like it was a success for them, and we've translated it back in here.
The cattle I truly enjoy, the horses even more so. The one thing that I love, just like this morning, a cloudy, cool morning, horses are feeling good, cattle are feeling good, and you can go out in that pasture and there are places that grass is belly deep on them horses, and to see them cattle just content and happy, they're not wild, they're not hungry. You know, they're so content out in the pasture.
Our goals is to manage the grass the best we can, the water that we have, and utilize that pasture. We are starting to add 10 to 30 head of cattle per pasture by rotating, using the water that we have. Even on some of the dry years, we're still finding that it's still working. And if we can leave some of this pasture, some of this grass left in the fall, is a huge thing for us to have a start in the spring.
It's not always about individual animal performance, but return on maybe the acre is a better way to look at the operational profitability. Can I raise more pounds of beef in a sustainable, profitable, and resilient way? And Mark, I think, attested to that. You know, going from 110, say, to 120, you're looking at, what, a 17% increase in carrying capacity? Those can be real dollars if you can protect the resource.
Biodiversity is huge, and whether we're talking about the number of insects in an area, the number of different kinds of wildlife in an area, or whether we're talking about different grass or wildflower species on the landscape, everything has a role in nature somewhere. And so if we can do something that's going to increase our biodiversity and the number of plants or wildflowers and the different kinds that we have in an area, we might only see one wildflower, but it might be that one species of flower that an insect or a bird needs to survive. And so when we're doing things like prairie restorations and these grazing management types of things, and we come to a place or we're working in an area like Northeast South Dakota where we have a lot of potential to increase biodiversity, we're gonna try and use seed mixes and restorations that are as diverse as they can be. That biodiversity can help mitigate things like weed problems. If we have something green and growing and flowering and leafy on the landscape, at all times of the year, it leaves a very, very narrow window for something like thistle to even creep into a landscape. It just can't function there because other plants are already occupying that space.
When we get up and we talk about things like alternative management, rotation, biological control, biodiversity, Calvin was one of those individuals that said, yeah, we're doing those things, we're doing as much as we can. We need to know that it's going to be profitable. We need to know that these things make sense in the big picture. And I always cherish producers that make us think very deeply about their profitability and their resilience on the land. It's easy to talk about the wildlife and the animals, but if we don't keep the people profitable, knowledgeable, and it sounds a little cliche, but sustainable, everything that we do as resource professionals really doesn't matter.
By doing some of the things that we have less problems with health issues. We don't have the foot rot, we don't have the eye problem, and we sure seem to think that our cattle are quieter by moving them every 5 to 7 days, and our gains are better than they have been in the past years. So we've been doing this for a lot of years. It's just something that's bred into us. We want to take care of the land, we want to take care of our water sources the best we can. That's been a big part of our operation.
From one big pasture in the 1970s, the Hoves now manage their grass by rotating cattle and have been able to increase their stocking rates, all while keeping their animals healthier and happier. And as Pete just said, very importantly, all of these various approaches to grassland management help keep our producers sustainable as well.